Okay, hello everybody. This is the CUDA Lab seminar on March 25, 2024. And today our greatest pleasure is to have David Kinney, who is now at Yale University, formerly or still at the Santa Fe Institute, measuring topical distinctness in stochastic block topic models. So this sounds more technical, but is highly related to sort of the notion of cultural interaction, language similarity, and stuff like that, where in digital humanities, topic modeling is almost a classic. Stochastic block models are a classic in network science, and distinctness is sort of something that everybody struggles with. Categories versus confusion is one of my favorite hobby horses. So we're very, very happy to have you. We have this 2 hours time slot that we usually perform this in. Sort of like usually guideline is 40 minutes talk, 80 minutes discussion, but you can do this however you want. Like we also, we can make it shorter. We cannot make it longer, but you can, whatever you want to do. You can take questions in between. We had cases where we started with a topic and like completely drifted away and talked about other things that were interesting. The key thing is we want to have a sort of like inspiring discussion, mutually inspired. Thank you.
Got it.
Stage is yours.
Well, thank you so much. Great. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be addressing this group and to be talking about this work. As you say, in some sense this is a technical topic, but I'm hoping for the presentation not to be too technical. Like there's a lot of pictures, not a lot of math. And moreover, I think I'm trying to get at this idea of, as you mentioned, topic models are this sort of classic methodology in digital humanities. And there's this idea of, okay, you can have a corpus and you can have a lot of different topics, but some topics are going to be very closely related in ways that might not be directly captured just by the content of the topics themselves, the probabilities assigned to the different words. They might be closely related in other ways that you might hope to capture, whereas other topics are going to be very distinct, right? So topics, there's this idea that kind of it lives out on its own island. It's an important part of the corpus, but it should be thought of as very sort of separate from other topics that are being discussed in the corpus. And what I'm going to be presenting here is an attempt to use these stochastic block topic models as a way of kind of capturing that idea of the distinctness or distinctiveness, whatever you want to call it, of a topic in a corpus. And what I'm going to be taking advantage of is the fact that these stochastic block topic models, which are this sort of slightly newer, I think starting in maybe 2018, we first sort of had these stochastic block model techniques being used for topic modeling. They have this nested hierarchical structure of topics that's sort of naturally learned. And the intuition here is something like, if you have a very distinctive topic at one sort of level of granularity, then as you go up in this nested hierarchy and you get sort of more coarse-grained topical structure, that distinctive topic should still be recognizable at these coarser levels of description. Whereas less distinctive topics will kind of just get mushed together as we go up in an abstraction hierarchy. So that's the idea. And I'm going to be sort of presenting that, giving some formal motivation behind it, and giving some examples as well over the course of this talk. So with that, I'll dive in and just start by reviewing sort of what a topic model is at a very high level. A topic model, in a sense, is a generative model. It's a model of how a corpus of text is generated. Right? So we represent a corpus as generated in a particular way, and the particular way we represent it as generated is like this. So imagine that the first thing you do is you pick a number from an urn, right? There's different balls in an urn, each one has a number written on it, and you pick a ball from that urn. Each number represents a topic, right? And now based on the topic there, so that's step one. Now in step two, based on the topic that you pick a word from the urn associated with that topic. And each of these urns, the same word can appear in multiple urns, but each urn is going to have some probability measure over this vocabulary of words, such that some words are going to have higher probability of being picked than others from within the same urn. If you like, you can imagine that, there are multiple balls in the urn and some words are written on multiple balls, whereas some words are written on fewer balls right? So now you've picked a topic, and then you've gone to that urn, and then you've picked a word from that urn, and then you add the word you pick to the document. And this is how you sort of build up the document. And we're abstracting away from any kind of ordering of words or anything like that. We're just looking at, okay, how did this particular bag of words come to be in this document? Well, that's the way that it was done. This is how the topic model represents the corpus as being generated. Right? Now, this distribution over topics in the first urn, this urn that we're sort of picking topics from in the first place, differs between documents. Right? And so how likely different topics are to be selected gives us a signal as to what each document is about, right? So if in this document, in one document, you're more likely to sample urn 1, well, in this case, that's probably a document that's about animals. If you were more likely to sample urn 10, then in this case, that's going to be a document that is likely about vegetables, right? And so on, right? So for a given corpus, the goal of the topic modeling, the goal of this sort of exercise is to learn the distributions over topics for each document and the distribution over the words that define each topic, right? Because what a topic is at the end of the day is ultimately a probability distribution over words that maximize the likelihood of sampling the observed corpus while avoiding overfitting, right? So this is the classic sort of statistical problem of what it means to sort of learn a generative model of some, observation, is to think, okay, what kind of model would be likely to generate this particular observation, this particular corpus, but can we learn this in a way that isn't subject to overfitting, that isn't the case that we get a model that's too, specifically fitted to our corpus to the point that it doesn't really sort of tell us something that could be used to generate new data or a new corpus or something like that, right? And the most common technique for doing this, probably familiar to many people in this audience, is latent Dirichlet allocation. This goes back to 2022, a classic paper by Bly, Ng, and Jordan, using this statistical sampling procedure of sort of sampling probability distributions from Dirichlet distributions and then inferring the parameters of these Dirichlet distributions as a way of getting us a topic model of a particular corpus, right? So that's the most common technique, is LDA, and it's still used in a lot of places for topic modeling, right? But there are 3 problems with using latent Dirichlet allocation for topic modeling. I'm going to sort of address each of these in turn and talk about how stochastic block models solve each of these problems. Well, the first is the number of topics to infer must be pre-specified, right? A parameter of an LDA topic model is, okay, I want to learn this many topics, usually it's called K, right? I want to learn 20 topics, or I want to learn 100 topics, or I want to learn 5 topics, etc. This has to be inputted by the user. And there are different sort of cross-validation techniques, trial and error, all kinds of things that you can do to arrive at a good value for this parameter. But at the end of the day, it's an exogenous parameter that you, the user, are putting in to the model, right? And in latent Dirichlet allocation, it's assumed that distributions over topics or words are sampled from a Dirichlet distribution, which is going to be unimodal, right? So this is a second problem with LDA for topic modeling, is that you might have sort of bimodal topic distributions, right, where there are two different topic distributions that are very likely, and others that aren't, and so you have this bimodal distribution. The Dirichlet distribution can't capture this, right? So this is a second problem, again, with this kind of more sort of parametric approach that one sees from LDA, right? And the third, which is going to be sort of most important to what I'm presenting here today, is that all of these topics are defined at a single level of abstraction, right? We're basically just saying at sort of one level of granularity, at one level of description, give me the topical structure of this corpus, right? What it's not giving us is something like, okay, say I want to look at this at a very fine-grained level. What are the topics that I would get? If I go to a more coarse-grained level, what are the topics that I would get? There's a sense in which you can run multiple topic models with different sort of values for that parameter for the number of topics to be inferred that might help you get some part of the way there, but it's really going to be sort of separate models rather than a single model with a nested hierarchical structure. And stochastic block topic models, which really starts with work by Gerlach and colleagues in 2018, are going to solve all three of these problems. So we're going to get a way of doing topic modeling where the number of topics to be inferred does not have to be pre-specified. Indeed, it's going to be sort of inferred by the model itself. Secondly, it's going to be sort of more non-parametric. It's going to allow for sort of bimodal and multimodal distributions. And then finally, it's going to give us sort of automatically, without having to sort of hard-code it in or anything like that, this hierarchical nesting of different topics. So those are the three things that we're going to get out of using stochastic block topic models. And so now I'll say a little bit about what stochastic block models are. I'm happy to pause at this point, though, because I've sort of set up the scope of what I'm doing here and ask if there are any questions, and feel free to just sort of shout them out or raise your hand.
Yes, any questions from the audience? I have one.
Yes.
So stochastic block models also traditionally had this issue that you need to specify the number of blocks, right? Or am I wrong? So how does it?
So that could be the case for the models that I'm using. They're basically doing Monte Carlo minimum description length, using those methods to get at to sort of infer the number of blocks.
So you run it a number of times, and you basically.
Yeah, well, I guess that's.
You will talk about this in a second. Exactly. So sorry, I don't know.
Yeah, no, I actually won't talk about the statistical details of how you're able to just sort of get a number of topics, a number of blocks without sort of specifying the parameter. So I won't talk about them in detail, but what I can tell you is that it's using a kind of simulation process, exactly a sort of maximum likelihood thing of sort of, penalizing having too many blocks, while at the same time wanting to, capture a certain amount of the data, right? And then you can do.
But then I think you don't have a unique answer, yes? So you probably have some sort of parameter coupled with this penalty, and changing this parameter, can make smaller blocks and larger blocks. Like
I couldn't hear that question very well. I'm sorry.
I see. Yeah, we have this tricky situation here. Okay, basically my question is that if you have if your solution is to have some sort of penalty for too large or too small number of blocks, then by changing the parameter of this penalty, you can have larger number of blocks and smaller number of blocks. Is it a bug or a feature in this case?
Yeah, that's right. And honestly, I'm not going that deep under the hood in sort of looking. I'd have to go back and look at exactly the MDL procedure that's in, Gerlach's stochastic block topic modeling software to say exactly sort of how that, how we're setting that parameter and what the issues would be. I think that's like a further subject for, contemporary discussion. But at the very least, you can set that parameter in such a way that it's not going to give you the same number of blocks for any corpus, right? It's going to be responsive to the nature of the corpus, right? So it's not saying, with LDA, you're kind of saying, okay, I want 25 blocks, and no matter what 25 topics, no matter what the corpus looks like, it's going to give you 25 topics. Whereas here, you're at least responsive to statistical features of the corpus in deciding how many blocks there are. And then you're right, there's this separate question of, okay, what's that penalty feature look like? What's that statistical procedure look like that's generating that particular number of blocks at each of these hierarchical levels for that particular corpus? Then you can investigate if you want to sort of tweak that around as well, whether you get different results. But at the very least, you're going to have the case that it's going to be, the number that you get is going to be in some sense responsive to the nature of the corpus rather than just something that you, the user, are putting in.
Okay, let's go. I think we can just continue. Great. Awesome. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. No problem. Awesome. Great. So at its core, a stochastic block model, like a topic model, is a generative model. But it's a generative model not on its own for generating a corpus, but rather for generating graphs. right? So here's an example of a graph, and for my part, for our purposes today, I'm just going to be talking about undirected graphs where you have nodes connected by edges. They can be connected by more than one edge. They're not in these examples, but they certainly can be. In principle, it could be a multi-graph if you like, but this is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about graphs, just sort of sets of nodes connected by different edges. And when we have a stochastic block model, a graph like the one, that should say the one on the left, sorry, is modeled as being generated by the following procedure, right? So first, we're going to divide these nodes into different communities or blocks, if you like. And then we're going to say, well, for any pair of nodes where one node is in community I and another node is in community J, define a probability, Pij, of a connection between the two nodes based on the communities that they belong to, and then actually generate the graph by sampling from that probability distribution and either drawing or not drawing an edge between those two nodes. And of course, you have intra-community probabilities of connection. So when you have two nodes that are in the same community, we have that probability, let's say they're both in community I, we have that probability PII of a connection between those two nodes in virtue of them being in the same community, but then also we have probabilities of connections between other communities as well. Right? And so we can imagine that we take this graph and we divide it into two communities. And in this case, you might say, look, the stochastic block model is sorting these nodes into two communities with high intra-community connection probability and lower inter-community connection probability. So that's how it would work in this case, right? And this is one reason why we tend to think of these stochastic block models on their own, and indeed they're used sort of first and foremost in this way as methods for community detection. Right, so you can imagine that this is a social network. Each of these nodes are sort of members of that social network, and each of these connections, or this person is friends with this person isn't friends with this person. You have the stochastic block model, and it very naturally gives you this sort of two community structure where there's only sort of one friendship pair between these two communities, but then within these communities you have a lot of interconnected connection pairs. So nodes are much more likely to be connected if they're within these paired groups than outside of these groups. That isn't the only kind of community structure an SBM can detect. You can imagine detecting community structures where two communities have low sort of intra-community connections, but high inter-community connections. It's all just going to depend on what's the sort of best generative model for this particular graph. And so you're going to get different insights into the community structure between these nodes based on what comes out as the best generative model, right? So these stochastic block models, once we sort of define them this way and think about them this way, they can form these nested hierarchies of generative models. And this is really, I think, important for thinking about how these get used in topic modeling, and in particular for thinking about how I'm motivating this measure of distinctiveness for the topic model, right? So we have, let's say we just have this graph here. This is something that I just drew. And now let's imagine that, looking at just these nodes, we end up with these three communities, right? We've got the yellow community here, the green community, and the blue community, right? So now we effectively have a 3-node graph. And then we can imagine, okay, there are connections between the yellow node, the yellow community, and the green community, which we can now think of as nodes in a more sort of higher level, more abstract level graph. We can think, okay, there's a yellow node and a green node, and there's a connection between them. And there's a blue node and a green node, and there's a connection between them. And moreover, this connection is really going to be 3 connections, right? Because we have 3 different paths connecting nodes in the blue community from nodes in the green community. Right? So now we've got this simpler graph with just 3 nodes and 2 edges, right? But then we can say, okay, let's say we wanted to learn a community structure, learn a sort of a generative model for this sort of higher level, more abstract level graph. Well, we can go ahead and do that by putting the green node and the blue node into a single sort of further community called the purple. We'll call this the purple node, and this is now encompassing both of those communities. And we'll say, there's a single edge connecting these two communities. So now we have this kind of nested hierarchical structure where we can take any given node and say, okay, let's say this node, it's in the blue community, but in virtue of being in the blue community, it's also in the purple community. Whereas if you're in the yellow node, you're in the yellow node at one level of abstraction, and then at a higher level of abstraction, you're still in the yellow node and you're not getting lumped in with any other nodes. So in thinking about, distinctiveness and what it means to be a distinctive topic, in this case, you would say, okay, these nodes, this yellow community, that's a more distinctive community than either, if I go back here, than either the green or the blue community. Why? Because the green and the blue community, they end up getting lumped together at a higher level of abstraction as we go up. Whereas if you're a node in the yellow community, you're not getting sort of lumped together with anyone else as we go up that abstraction hierarchy. Right? So that's the idea. That's how these stochastic block models are able to form these nested hierarchies. And in a very complicated graph, you could imagine 5, 6, 7, 8, levels of abstraction, levels of hierarchy as we go up this sort of community detection ladder. Right? Now, how can we use this to turn a stochastic block model into a topic model? Pause for a second. So the way that Gerlach and colleagues do this is as follows. We represent a corpus as a bipartite graph. And in one column, a bipartite graph, you can think of as basically just two columns of nodes where connections are only allowed between columns, right? So you have no inter-column connections, right? And in one column, we have nodes representing all of our different documents. And in the second column, we have nodes representing all the different words in the vocabulary of our corpus. So every sort of unique word in the corpus, each of those is getting a node in the right-hand column, let's say. So left column documents, right column nodes. And in this corpus, we have M documents and Q words. Right? And then we draw an edge between a document and a word every time that word appears in the document. So what we end up with is this kind of multi-graph where each edge has an integer associated with it, where that integer is going to be the sort of number of times that the word occurs in the document. So in this case, we would say, okay, just looking at document 1, we have word 1 occurring twice, word 2 occurring once, word 3 occurring 3 times, word 4 occurring once, and then word Q, which is our last word, that occurs twice. And I've just shown this just for the first document, just to not sort of have things be super complicated. But in principle, we could do this, for all of the different documents, right? And indeed, when you have one of these generated, you're going to have, all the documents are going to have sort of some connections between different words as well. And of course, your right-hand column is probably going to be a lot larger than your left-hand column. But in any event, this is the graph that we form, and this is the sort of graphical representation of the entire corpus. And, abstracting away from the ordering of words and things like that, this is just more of a sort of bag of words approach. It does give you the sort of full sort of bag of words view of the corpus as a whole. So we've set up this bipartite graph, and now what do we do? Well, let's divide words and documents into communities, and we sort of specify that, when we learn this community structure, documents are always going to be in their own communities, and words are always going to be in their own communities. And the communities on the word side of the graph, these groupings of words, those are your topics. So we can imagine, if you see here, we can imagine we've divided these documents into communities red and green, and these words into communities blue and yellow. And so for each community of words, we'll call that a topic T. And then for each topic T, we can define a probability distribution over words, where the probability of a word according to a topic T is the probability that that word appears in any document that's connected to any word in T. Right, so this is the idea that, okay, the probability of a word according to a topic is the proportion or the probability with which that word appears in all documents connected to that word. Right? And because we have this stochastic block model, we can have this nested hierarchy where we can say of any given word, okay, at one level of description, it's in this topic, But at another level of description, it's in this other topic, which is going to have a different distribution over words because it might contain more words or fewer words, usually more words, and so on. It might be combining different topics at the lower level, or for the cases I'm most interested in, it might be that the same community of words is kind of preserved across levels of abstraction and across sort of coarse graining. Right, so we'd be interested in both of those cases where we're lumping words together and also where we're not. Right? So that's sort of we're getting now to what was really the kind of main proposal here, which is to use this nested hierarchy for stochastic block topic models to define a measure of distinctiveness for a given topic. Right. So here's how we'll do this. Right. So let's let T be a topic defined at level I of some hierarchy of topics inferred by a stochastic block topic model. And then let's let capital T with subscript I be the set of all topics inferred at this level of hierarchy, right? With these formal definitions in place, we can define the distinctiveness of a topic as follows. So the distinctiveness of topic T is just going to be 1 over, and this is just to invert the relationship. The minimum callback-Liebler divergence between that topic and any other topics at a higher level of description. So at one rung up this sort of nested hierarchy, what's the minimum divergence between a topic at that higher level, between our topic that we're measuring the distinctiveness of, and any topic at that higher level of abstraction, right? Now, what is this doing? Well, if you have low divergence between some topic at the higher level of abstraction and the topic that we're measuring the distinctiveness of, that means that even as we're coarse graining up, even as we're going to this higher level of abstraction, there is still a topic at that higher level that is very similar to this topic that we're interested in at the lower level. And what this is showing is that the structure of the topic, the distribution inherent in the topic, is preserved across coarse graining, is preserved across this move to higher levels of description. And what that shows is that the topic is distinctive. It's in the sense that as we go up in the hierarchy, we're not seeing this topic being combined and diluted by other topics in a way that would lead to divergence between that topic at the lower level and any topic that exists at the higher level. Now, you might think, okay, well, what if a topic is perfectly preserved at the higher level such that this numerator will be 0? Well, it turns out that that happens, and then we just want to say, okay, distinctiveness there is maximal. That's where this fraction would, in a sense, be undefined. We can say, okay, we could call that positive infinity and just say, okay, that's a maximally distinctive topic because the exact same topic appears at a lower level in this nested hierarchy, and then again at a higher level of this nested hierarchy, right? And so just to summarize, what do we say? Well, what is a distinctive topic? Well, it's a topic that has low divergence from some higher level topic, suggesting that its content is not diluted by coarse graining. That's how we're operationalizing this idea of the distinctiveness of a topic. Right? So let's turn to some examples on real-world corpora to sort of show how this would go. Well, in the original paper from Gerlach et al., they trained a stochastic block topic model on a corpus of 63 Wikipedia articles about physics, right? And this is really just meant to be a proof of concept. Obviously, this is a very small corpus, but it's one that you can, sort of run really quickly to sort of confirm that your topic model is working, right? So I replicated their analysis. In their paper, they report obtaining 21 topics at the lowest level of the hierarchy. I obtain 18 topics at the lowest level of the hierarchy, and then 3 topics at the second level of the hierarchy, and they also get 3 in their runs as well. So it's interesting the ways in which we have stability and instability across different runs of these stochastic block topic models. I think there's still more work to be done to sort of make all this stuff really replicable and look at things like p-values and stuff like that about sort of how stable these models are, but certainly it's not sort of a massive divergence from what they find in their paper. And using this proposal, I was able to measure the topics with highest distinctiveness of those sort of 18 lowest level topics, right? And here were those two topics, right? So remember, these are articles about physics. So the first one is quantum, 11% probability of sampling quantum from this topic, surface, light, effect, velocity, wave, change, particles, angular constant, right? The second most distinctive topic of these 18 topics is Newton body laws, classical air, waves, water, tank, Pauli forces, right? So just looking at the first words in these two topics, quantum and Newton, I think you can see right here that we've got these 63 Wikipedia articles. What are the most distinctive topics at that lowest level of analysis? Well, it's one topic about quantum mechanics and one topic about classical mechanics, right? And we see that both of these topics are fairly well preserved when we go up to that higher, that second level of the hierarchy, where now we only have three topics. We're seeing that both this quantum mechanical topic and this classical mechanical topic are sort of having low divergence from one of those three topics at the second level, probably because at that second level, we're getting more screening into classical subjects, quantum subjects, and a third, right? And in fact, if you look at the sort of breakdown of topics at that second level, this is basically what we see.
Sorry, what are?
Yes.
So what are the three topics there?
So I don't have those printed out here. I'd have to go run again what the three topics are at the second level of description. What I'm telling you now is that at the lower level, these are the two with highest distinctiveness, right? I could follow up with you on that and see see what those three are.
That's from the sort of person with physical background. I don't think it makes particularly much sense, this particular sets of well, it's not immediately obvious that the first one somehow has velocity and for some reason surface, and why it is like and the second one has Pauli, which is sort of a name associated with quantum mechanics usually. So
yeah.
Both of them have waves, so there's a little bit. It is not immediately clear, apart from the first word, that all the rest are lining up, one for in sort of quantum mechanical topics and another in classical mechanical topics.
No, I mean, as ever with these things, it's never perfect, but I think you do have to, in interpreting a topic, I think there are a couple of things you have to think about. You know, both the list of words themselves, but also the probability being assigned to each of those words. So, you know, this is telling us, okay, how likely is this particular word to be sampled, you know, in generating this document? And certainly on the right-hand side, we see Newton body laws, classical. Those are all four, right? Here, you know, it's a little trickier, but you know, quantum obviously as the number one word to be sampled. I think, you know, if you're writing a document by sampling, and there's an 11.3% chance that you're going to use the word quantum every time you pick a word, I think that's a pretty good indication that that document is in some sense about quantum mechanics, right? And so I think that, especially in a corpus of 63 Wikipedia articles about physics, right? So that's why I think in interpreting these things, I want to look at not just the list of words as a whole, but you know, what those probabilities look like as well. Because if you look at the right-hand side, you know, you're right that Pauli more associated with quantum mechanics, of course, but on the other hand, we're still twice as likely to sample Newton than we are to sample Pauli in this topic, right? So there's some noise in here for sure, but nevertheless, I think that we can look at these two topics. These are the most distinctive topics, and they're sort of mapping on, I think, in interesting ways to this sort of quantum classical distinction. But you're right. I mean, as ever with interpreting topics, I think you have to recognize that there's going to be some noise, and also I think about, okay, what are the probabilities associated with these words rather than just the lists of words themselves.
So I have two questions, maybe if I can ask them. So one thing for clarity. So you said on the topic side, you're like you have this bipartite network which documents and words, and then you divide them into topics. So basically this means in this particular case, and it's different from classic LDA, it's not like a probability is assigned to all words belonging to all topics, but in this particular case, you divide the number of words first into topics. So that means waves is only in the Newton topic, while wave is only in the quantum topic. Is that true?
So that is a helpful clarification, actually. If we go back here, I've represented this as there's no overlap between these blocks.
Yes.
And in fact, that's often what you see, but that is not a guarantee of the procedure. So it could be, for instance, that word 3 appears in, let's say there's a word 5 that appears in both the blue block and the yellow block, right? So now it's appearing in both.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
So what you do is not a classic one-mode projection and then do discrete community finding, basically, but there is something else going on. So you could actually indeed have overlap. But
yeah,
not
you could
all
have
words appear in all topics. Is that true, or?
It is true that not all words appear in all topics. So if a word is not in that topic at all, then it's getting 0 probability within that topic. It's not part of the support of that topic. And in fact, in my experience, whenever I run these stochastic block topic models, I tend to get a lot of community structure where words aren't appearing in multiple topics. But in principle, you can have overlap, right? But the probability distributions will still be different because you'll be looking at that prevalence of words of that one word within a different community, right? So, it might be that, one word appears in 2 communities, but in documents connected to the first community, the word has a very high proportion of appearances. In documents connected to the second community, the word has a much lower proportion of appearances. And so it has a different probability of being sampled within those 2 communities, right?
Okay.
Now, in practice,
I have now a much more profound question, which I didn't have before. So network communities, particularly if they're discrete, is like, and please excuse me, my PhD is in art history, is if you can draw a line around a bunch of nodes on a piece of paper in a node link diagram. While my naive sort of assumption about block models, sort of Hayek kind of style, would be that you can sort together columns and rows in the matrix of the same network, so they form rectangles, which are mutually discrete. So what you're saying is that here there is things happening where the same node can be part of 2 rectangles, basically. And then
in principle, I don't see it in practice very often, but in principle.
Okay. Okay, I got okay, good. Like just go on. Thank you very much.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah. Right. So that was one example on real world corpora. And then just very quickly, an example, another real world corpora. So in a previous paper, I trained one of these stochastic block topic models on 1,733 abstracts from the online philosophy repository Phil papers that were tagged as being relevant to the subdiscipline of formal epistemology. That's formal epistemology is what I work in. It's this area of philosophy that uses mostly probability theory, but other areas of mathematics besides, to investigate norms of knowledge and belief and things like that. In that paper, I was really interested in diachronic trends over time in these different, within formal epistemology, seeing, sort of what techniques had fallen out of fashion, what techniques have risen in fashion. But I came back to it and thinking about this distinctiveness measure and just trying to see, okay, what does it look like if we try and look for distinctive topics in this corpus that, I'd already compiled, right? So I reran that model and I found 108 topics at the lowest level of the hierarchy. And 3 of them were maximally distinctive, meaning that they're perfectly preserved when we go up to that second level of the hierarchy, right? So 2 of them, the ones on the far left and the far right, I don't have a great interpretation of, right? In fact, in both of them, we see, fairly sort of low probability for all of the words, suggesting that, and this does happen with stochastic block topic models, suggesting that they don't actually really have a clear interpretation. There's a sense in which they're a bit of sort of noise in the generative model, right? On the other hand, this middle topic is very interesting, right? Causal experiments, intervention, Cartwright, and net. So net here means I know from context it's referring to a Bayesian network or BayesNet or causal network diagram, right? Causal here, 85%, experiments, interventions. Cartwright, Nancy Cartwright, philosopher who's worked a lot on causation over the years. And there's only 5 words in this block at all. There's only 5 words with positive probability here at all. So this is clearly, to me, as in my interpretation, clearly a topic about causation in the philosophy of science, right, as it relates to formal epistemology. And we're seeing that it's very distinctive. It's maximally distinctive. It's basically entirely preserved at this second level of the hierarchy, right? The model doesn't want to lump it in with anything else, right? And this confirms something that I sort of noted qualitatively in that paper, the 2023 paper, without formally sort of measuring it all, which is this idea that, this causal modeling topic, this sort of causation and philosophy of science topic, seems to sort of show up in 2 places at both levels of the hierarchy, suggesting that there's something very distinctive about it, right? That it's kind of has its own unique place within the corpus. Now, sort of turning it to, having this more formal measure of distinctiveness, we see that, the same result is preserved. Now we can go to the second level of the hierarchy where there are 20 topics inferred by the model. So with 20 topics, we can then think, okay, you're at the second level of the hierarchy. If we go even up to the third, right, which topics at that second level are being preserved and how much are they being preserved? And in fact, even at the second level of the hierarchy, we still get a maximally distinctive topic. We still get a topic that is sort of completely preserved at that third level of description. It's a very interesting one. So if you look at these words, with the exception of John, we've got de, la, que, en, un, die, der, und, las. Pretty clear what this is. This is a topic corresponding to documents in this corpus that are not written in English, right? So I think a mix of very like typical stop words from French, German, Spanish, right? So this topic of sort of words from non-English languages is completely distinctive, right? This I think is very nice sort of confirmation for the sort of operationalization of this idea of distinctiveness in general, that we're basically saying, okay, like abstracts written in languages other than English, they are kind of their own part of this corpus that just in virtue of the linguistics are going to be very isolated from the rest of the corpus. And what we're seeing is that at the second level of hierarchical description, we obtain this, it emerges this unique, distinctive part of the corpus, this distinctive topic. And we know that it's distinctive, not only for the qualitative reason that, surely if someone's writing in a language other than English, they're sort of part of their own little part of this mostly Anglophone corpus, but also we can actually measure it and show that when we go up to another level of abstraction, this non-English topic is completely preserved. Right, so I found that to be like a really nice result, showing that, when we're operationalizing this idea of distinctiveness, we're actually able to sort of catch on to something that makes a lot of sense. I found this result I felt like I had a bit of construct validity when I obtained this result. But what's interesting and what I don't have a good explanation for right now is that why this distinctive topic would only emerge one level up at the hierarchy. We get this, in this model run, we got this very fine-grained level of description of 108 topics. And it's only when we went sort of one rung up the ladder to a more 20-topic, more coarse-grained approach that we even get the emergence of this non-English sort of topic in the first place. And it's only at that level of description that we can then assess its distinctiveness. So I don't have the answers there for why this would suddenly emerge when we go to 20 topics, when we go to that sort of first level of coarse graining. But it's sort of interesting to sort of consider the dynamics of these models more and see why that might be the case. Right?
Can I ask a question?
So, yes.
Can you go back one slide?
Sure.
So if you take the rightmost community, which is maximally distinctive, and you just throw the words into Google, there's exactly one paper on the internet that fits this description.
Oh, interesting.
So which is Semmelweis on childbirth, whatever, or child death. So for obvious reasons, like in your data set, in the 1,733 abstracts, there's only one abstract that fits this particular topic.
Yeah.
Now, to analyze that, which obviously should be the case, right? It should end up being this like distinctive thing. Now, if you go to the next slide, to your Spanish thing, like if you have a 108 topics, this is you can actually play, like, it's sort of the 1733 plays to your favor, because 1733 abstracts is totally something one could read, at least the titles of the papers. And so that means in this particular case, you probably know how many Spanish abstracts are in your data set. And then the question is like, if that Spanish hierarchy, the Spanish distinctiveness only appears at level 2, but not at the bottommost level, then one would surmise you got minimum 2 types of papers going on that are Spanish, but differentiated by some kind of other thing. And so, so I don't know how
what's interesting. Well, yeah, I think, what's interesting is that this isn't just Spanish, right? I'd love to go, now that you bring this up, first of all, I love, popping those into Google. That's like really clever in figuring that out, because what makes me think is almost like, that doesn't sound like a formal epistemology paper, right? So in some sense, you might think, okay, this is a paper that in some sense has maybe been miscategorized, or at least sort of strangely categorized, which would make sense then that it forms this kind of, it sort of instantiates this distinctive topic. Here, we're calling it the Spanish topic, but there's, die, der, and und, or obviously, German.
All foreign papers, right? Basically. Okay. Yeah, this makes
sense. So it's all. Yeah. So then I wonder whether at that.
Okay. Sorry.
Yeah. So then I wonder whether, if I go into all 108 of those topics, if we might not see even more separation into the different sort of non-Anglo-European languages. And then those are all being coarse-grained up into this sort of one topic that's then distinctive at the next level.
Yes. This reminds me a lot of the box called International in all American record stores, where you have, sort of like 49% rock and roll, 49% R&B, 1% I don't know, and then there's a tiny box that says International that has all the German, French, and non-English Spanish records. Right.
Yeah. Or in the Academy Awards, the best foreign film category. Yeah. Right. So this is as I said, I think this is nice construct validity that this measure of distinctiveness would pick out this kind of topic, because I think intuitively it is just sort of a very distinctive topic. And I think, just some good discussion here on why this would only emerge one level up at the hierarchy. And this, brings me close to the end of the presentation. I just want to sort of reflect a little bit on what we gain from measuring the distinctiveness of a topic. I mean, for me, it's a fun exercise. You learn more about how the code works by sort of having to, sort of calculate these Kullback-Leibler divergences. But what do we really gain from measuring the distinctiveness of a topic? So, recall the origins of stochastic block models as mechanisms for community detection and graph-structured data. Distinctive communities can be understood as those with many inter-community connections, but few sort of connections to the outside world, just as, pumping this idea of, what it means to be a distinctive community. And so even if we were to sort of coarse grain our partition of nodes into, sort of larger and larger communities, these isolated close-knit communities, they're going to remain distinct, right? And so in the very general sense of sort of community detection, this is sort of what we're latching onto when we latch onto a distinctive community, right? And we can think of these distinctive topics as close-knit, isolated semantic themes within a larger corpus, persisting even as we aim to take a more coarse-grained perspective. And I think this helps us in some ways separate signal from noise in topic modeling, especially when we have many topics at a fine-grained level of description. You can imagine, especially, one aspect of these SBM models is that you don't directly control the number of topics inferred. So it does come to pass, and sometimes you get very highly fine-grained topics. And you might think, okay, how many of these are sort of genuine topics versus how many of them are, could really be lumped together and could really be thought of as, well, this one and this one, they're kind of really about the same thing. And if you look at the paper that I wrote using that formal epistemology corpus, in a few cases, I actually manually lumped two topics together because they were just so similar in terms of the probabilities that they were assigning to words. Having this measure of distinctiveness, I think, helps us gain some traction on that and say, okay, what are the actually sort of distinctive topics at one level, using this hierarchy as a way of operationalizing that, right? So the last thing I just want to conclude with is to look at this avenue for future work. In a lot of my work these days, I'm doing a lot of experimental cognitive science, empirical psychology type work. And I'd love to explore, whether the proposed measure of distinctiveness tracks people's intuitive judgments about the most distinctive themes or topics in a corpus. Is there some way of getting some empirical validation for this idea of distinctiveness? And then, as a kind of entry point into the broader question of, to what extent are these stochastic block models matching people's sort of intuitive understanding, both of the topical structure of a corpus and in particular sort of the hierarchical relationships between topics in a corpus, right? So that takes me to the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for listening, and then I'm happy to sort of continue the conversation from here.
Thank you very much. Okay, thank you. So, any questions from the audience? Yes, Mila Oiva.
Yeah, thank you. Super interesting talk, and I got some kind of like food for thought here. I'm not a literary scholar, but I just started to think that well, you gave these two examples where you have been testing this to Wikipedia data and also to this philosophical literature. But I just started to wonder if we would do this, run this topic modeling on very different types of literature, such as, I don't know, from school books to very high-end literature to poetry, children's books, and so on and so forth. Because usually there is this kind of like intuitive notion that in different types of texts, there are different kind of like hierarchies of concreteness, and also hierarchies of kind of like, symbolism and these kinds of things. So I just, I'm not, like I said, I'm not a literary scholar. I don't have any deep understanding on that, nor do I have deep understanding on your model. But I just started to think that, how about, what if we would do this kind of like to different types of literature, and would it be then, if we would see kind of like how many levels of hierarchy we get, would that be, interesting to you also, to see kind of like how do different texts work, and what kinds of like hierarchies we can identify there? Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for that kind of, I mean, that's definitely, this is, I just used two examples. I should say this is something I've been wanting to, the formal side of this and this idea of distinctiveness is something I've been wanting to look into for a long time, and I use this talk kind of as an impetus to do it. So it's very new work in that sense. So there's a lot of corpora that one could consider. One, just doing a stochastic block topic model of, because this method for topic modeling is still fairly nascent. And then two, specifically looking at, distinctiveness and sort of what we can get out of the nested structure in particular. So all of the examples that you gave of different corpora, I think, would all be interesting in their own right. I think, as ever with this kind of work, I think the tightrope to walk, right, is between not wanting to tell people something they already knew, and also wanting to not have something with sort of very low construct validity, right? Have something that says something so new that it's almost not, that it can't possibly be correct, right? So, you imagine you uncover this sort of hierarchy of themes in Shakespeare's plays or something, and all the Shakespeare scholars say, yes, we've known this for 200 years. You haven't told me anything new. On the one hand, nice, okay, it shows that this model can sort of has construct validity. It can latch on to the things that we already know people care about. On the other hand, it hasn't gotten us a new insight, right? So I think in terms of thinking about, okay, what can we get epistemologically out of these kinds of nested hierarchies, I think it's still like an open question. I mean, the closest thing in everything I presented today that comes to sort of striking that right balance is some of the stuff I presented in the philosophical corpus, where on the one hand, we're saying, okay, this causal modeling, part of the corpus, that's very distinct. And unless, I don't think it would necessarily even be obvious to any of the experts, being myself sort of practitioner in that field, it wouldn't necessarily be obvious that that's the case. Now, on the other hand, you get this high distinctiveness, maximal distinctiveness for non-Anglophone texts. Well, knowing that the corpus is mostly Anglophone, that's sort of, okay, that sort of shows us, okay, yes, the thing works, and here's a cool new insight from it. So I think we definitely kind of want the same thing if we're thinking about applying this to all different kinds of literature, right? So, poetry, prose, children's literature, literature, etc. Right? So that's what I would say there is, figuring out how to walk that tightrope is, I think, not an easy thing, but that's the kind of thing that I want to keep doing. And hopefully some of this idea of, what's a distinctive topic and sort of operationalizing that in the way that I have could be useful in that regard.
Mike.
Can I have the mic?
Yes, the mic for Mike.
Yeah, basically, thank you very much. That's very interesting. And basically, my question is mostly on the technical side. As far as I understood, what you are doing is literally this Gerlach-Pixot-Altman model. And
Yep.
how it is technically done? Is it a sort of an available code or some sort of, you said you do some sort of pre-training. Can you elaborate a little bit more, just on practical purpose for me as a person who is interested to do something like this in the future? So how it is done, where to go for the code and stuff like this?
Yeah, absolutely. I can send you. I could, if you email me to remind me, I'd be happy to send you a link to their GitHubs and all that stuff. I find they have some Colab implementations. I was hoping to use those. I found it very difficult to install the graph tool package that PXO has written in my Colab. So I, ages ago, and thankfully still have it on my computer, installed GraphTool. I actually ended up I have a slightly different kernel just for running SBMs. I found that was what helped me sort of get it all to work. But you likely are better at Python than me and better at computers than me, so it might be easier for you. And then the main thing is also, in addition to the GraphTool package that you have to import, which is a little non-trivial because it's kind of this sort of standalone package. You also have to add, there's just a .py file called SBMTM, Stochastic block model topic model. And I just pop that into the working directory and import it in. And then that has basically all of the commands that you need to run the model and to run some of these queries on the different topic distributions that enable you to calculate Kullback-Leiblers and things like that. And then the one other thing that I'll say is the sort of default mode for actually loading in the corpus is just a .txt file with one line per document. All right, so that's the simplest way to do it. But you could probably do other things if you had a CSV or something like that, or JSONs even. I'm sure it's doable. But the simplest way is just to have in your working directory a .txt with one line per document, and then it works very well on that. And depending on the size of the corpus, like for those 1,700 abstracts, it took about 5 minutes to run locally. It'll go up as it goes up, obviously.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, anybody else? Okay, so yeah, I have I'm a very visual person, and whenever I encounter a classification system like this, I would visualize that. And one of the interesting things, and this is often coming as a critique, is if you look at raw frequencies, you don't have a generating mechanism as a model, but you just look at the frequencies. But this is also sometimes very therapeutic, because you see certain things that if you have an assumption about, say, words, documents, language, and so on, they're not that obvious. And so one of the things which I'm curious about is, and let me ask a question first, and then maybe I give you some background with like what I have in mind. Like these 1,733 abstracts which you're working with, they were on one particular genre, you could say super topic. Is that correct?
That's right.
So then can you let me just ask a number of questions to wrap my head around this. So we have 1,733 abstracts, which probably approximately 350 to 500 words long, because that's how they look like. And that means probably a lot of the words are repeating. So, but still you may have on the order of 10,000 words, say, or something like that appear there, right? So okay. So then do you weed out things like the, he, is, she, it? Like, do you do a kind of stop words kind of thing, or? So
in that corpus, I removed stop words.
Okay, so that's the reason the TH is still in, but the is not in. The TH was
that's right.
Probably some print mistake of something like that. Okay.
That's right.
So factually, we get a bipartite classification of, say, 10,000 words on one side and 1,700 abstracts on the other side, which is a really thorough sort of, you could say, overclassification in a library classification sense, where people maximally put 3 words or 3 concepts onto a paper. So here we have minimum, sort of there's a much larger sort of density of your network going on, even on the bipartite case. And then we're doing this thing which is not a one-mode projection, that is classically, so there's some sort of more, you don't do regular blocks. This is what I want to say. So you don't split the words, but the words can appear in multiple topics. So that is quite a lot of information, and probably you have the same issues you would have with one-mode projections, as you sort of overemphasize certain connections, while others, if a word only appears in one thing, then the most distinctive stuff is not even in there, basically. So or works itself out. So okay, so that's one case. The other case is 63. You said Wikipedia articles. So basically, this is literally. So there's the ground truth would be there cannot be more than 63 topics on the lowest level, because, right? Am I wrong about this, or so there?
Because it's the full articles, so the topics are groupings of words, right, not documents.
Okay.
So for words, you still have, if I recall from that corpus, I think you still have something like 30,000 unique words there.
Okay.
Because it's full Wikipedia articles.
Okay, so they're longer. So maybe 63 articles, but still thousands of words, probably, right?
Yep.
Okay. So let me give you another example. I'm for a very long time interested in topic modeling, but I never did it because I was coming from a world of library classification where you don't have full texts. So you have sort of the luxury that the bipartite network already exists. And if you look at the frequencies, you get something really interesting, which is there is tail distributions everywhere. There is literally no such thing as an average or a unimodal distribution anywhere. But the number of topics per, the number of sort of documents per word, in your case, would be sort of a power law distribution. The number of vice versa, the same thing. Maybe there would be more cut off depending on the nature of your documents. The persistence would be, over time, would also be such a power law distribution, stuff like that. And then the number of topics in which a word occurs would also, sub-branches in your hierarchy, would also be a power law. So let me give you an example. Imagine you have a topic that only has food items, okay, like dumplings, bread, salt sticks, whatever, right? Anything you can buy in a supermarket. And then you have another topic, which is countries. So this should be rather straightforward, right? You have sort of Georgia, Estonia, United States, Germany, France, Italy, Spain, and stuff like that. So now it turns out you could do a maximally distinctive category, if you call it Georgian dumplings, Siberian dumplings, Estonian dumplings, German dumplings, and so on, right? So there could be a world where one library says Germany and dumpling, while another library says German dumpling. So you could imagine the same information has a perfect distinctiveness, while in another thing, this must be by nature overlapped because of the construction of your classification criteria. It turns out that in most cases, this is actually happening at the same time. So because there's different people classifying, different people writing abstracts, this thing will sort of like automatically appear. So why am I saying this? So one of the key issues is that knowledge, by definition, cannot be a strong tree. So you cannot have a tree where there is sort of like things at the bottom only appearing in one community. At some point, you need to have some kind of interaction, because otherwise you're not saying something. And so then the question is, how is the tree constructed from your data, basically? Do you take into external information? Is it this kind of thing? So the structure of the tree as a whole becomes super, super important. So what I'm after here is the following. Like you talk about distinctive communities and you single them out, which is like obviously perfectly valid in a paper to say, I'm interested in this sort of distinctiveness thing. But what we have not learned about is the structure of the tree as a whole, the structure of the data as a whole. And that may totally govern what will be your result. Like you said, oh, like foreign languages behave like this and that. This is true for a set of abstracts in a field where you got like one German, one Spanish, one Italian abstract. But if you would do the same thing, say, in a field where it's perfectly normal to publish in different languages, like art history as opposed to chemistry, whatever, or physics, then you would end up in a situation where this would be much more intermingled. And so the structure of your tree would completely change. So it's not just nestedness, meaning that your tree is branching, but the actual width and the depth and the cross connection between the tree, which is, I think, something, if you want to have a true characterization of your generating model, something that should be characterized. And in some sense, I think there is a huge opportunity to sort of like just draw these trees and sort of like give people sort of like an intuition about like what's happening there. And then I think there is actually probably, I'm not sure if somebody else has done this already. There is a sort of opportunity to play with the topology of these trees and actually try to figure out how that influences this stochastical block topic model. And that is a kind of curious thing, because I'm not aware, but this may be my own shortcoming, of a lot of work where people do community finding at the same time looking at nestedness. I know there is work, there's a famous ecology paper where they say, actually, community modularity structure and nestedness are sort of like almost complementary, right? Because if you're a strong tree that is subdividing, you cannot have, obviously, sort of like in your matrix. If you're nested, which is this pattern, you cannot have sort together nice rectangles along the diagonal, and vice versa. But in between, it's not a linear sort of thing. But in the middle, there is some kind of weird stuff that's possible, where it's a little skewed. You can have sort of both, and which may be why we end up with sort of this Zipfian distribution in our classification structures, because obviously they're near criticality, and you want to have both. You want to have sort of distinctiveness, while at the same time you want to have some kind of overlap with the others. And so this sort of like this nature of criticality could only be analyzed if you look at the system as a whole, not just at like sort of one branch or something like that. I'm sorry for the monologue, but it's sort of
no worries. So what I got out of that most, which I find very interesting, is this. So in the approaches that I presented today, and and the approach that if you download their software that you're able to do in Python, that in that approach, that as I presented, the graph structure is given by the data, right? So you get this bipartite graph and it comes right out of the data. So it's entirely empirically constructed and entirely determined by the data. But of course, you may think there are ways to leverage domain knowledge to represent a corpus graphically in different ways, right? So whether it's connections between words, whether it's weighting connections between documents and words differently, whether it's putting connections between documents, etc. And this could be done with the block modeling sort of outcome in mind, in the sense that you're saying, okay, I'm doing this because what I want to capture in the nested hierarchy is something like this or something like that. I have not thought about that before, but it's an incredibly interesting way to go. I think there's the real question there is sort of, okay, what's the domain knowledge that you're leveraging? Maybe it's something that's coming from another resource, like a library resource, something like that, or maybe it's just coming from your head as the experimenter, and then you're sort of putting in your domain knowledge into this graphical structure. And then that's obviously going to affect the kinds of communities that are detected, the kinds of structures that are learned. At a certain point, I think it raises the question, do we even want to treat this as a topic model anymore? Or is it doing something else, right, that's still interesting and relevant in terms of the picture that it's painting of our corpus? But yeah, I don't think I have much more to say beyond that. If we drop the assumption that's motivating this work, that the graph structure is given to us by the data and has this bipartite form, but instead the graph structure could be coming from elsewhere, then there's, I think, a lot we can do in digital humanities to leverage that. But I think what the story that needs to be fleshed out more is where that structure is coming from.
I'm actually suggesting the opposite. Okay, so
okay.
My example was coming from domain knowledge from a case where, in this particular case, we would have 670,000 books and 37,000 classification criteria.
Yeah.
But what I'm suggesting is throw away the domain expertise. Only look at the topology of the network, of the bipartite network. So if you have words on one side and you have your documents on the other side, you obviously don't want to throw it fully away, but for the moment, look at the topology of that network, like simply that network has a huge influence, like how that network is constructed. In your case, you take abstracts, which is not the full papers, but it's supposedly already words that are sort of important more than the words in the rest of the paper. Otherwise, they wouldn't be in the first couple of lines. Connected so that this is your document, and then you have these words, and they may be appearing in multiple places here. So as you filter out stop words, a lot of the density of this matrix must go away. So you're basically artificially getting rid of stuff like the he, she, it, this, and whatever. As you're only looking at words, like all the meaning you have left is in the words itself, but not in the combination of words. So again, that does something to your matrix. So you don't have the word combinations, which you could just add. Like, basically in addition to your words, you would have the n-grams in the thing, which would obviously specify your thing much more. So the one is making it more specific by throwing out the sort of common words. And the other thing is making it more unspecific because you get rid of the sentence structure. So there is a very clear thing which obviously differentiates your model from the Wikipedia case. The Wikipedia case is not the first 10 lines, it's all the words that are relevant. So you're making this, there's a different step here, but so these should look different already. Now, take a library classification, a random one, you will see that there is a smaller number of words attached to the document, so your matrix must be more sparse. And then still look at that structure of that matrix and how that influences what you do later with your stochastic block topic model. Because obviously the density of this matrix, the specificity or commonality of links in this matrix has a huge influence on nestedness. Like obviously a sparse matrix cannot be as nested as a dense one. And number two, it has a huge influence on the possible community structure. So there's a really
good.
crazy network science problem going on, which, I would envy nobody who solves that thing, because it's a tedious work where it was complete in probably many dimensions. But this has a huge influence. And as humanists or psychologists or whatever, we cannot ignore that this is a key topology. Yep. So in some sense, we need to do topology while having the mind of a humanist. It's probably why it didn't happen yet.
Good. Yeah, so I see what you're saying now. So the idea is, like, for the same corpus, you imagine the sparse version that just includes library classifications, and then there's the dense version that includes, all of the words. Let's just say all the words in the books, just the two extremes, right? And then there's the question of, I think it's just an interesting research question: can we quantify? Can we understand? Can we look at differences both in the topology themselves, but then also in these nested block structures that are being inferred between the two cases, and maybe even measure to some extent how much information is lost in the sparser model. And indeed, if there's minimal information lost in the sparser model, does that in some sense quantify and redound to the benefit of the library classification of the other sparser model? I think that's like really interesting questions to look at. And I think that what's nice about this framework is that it provides like a very sort of clear methodology for how you might go about something like that. So still with some details to be filled in, but any topic that involves granularity and information loss and sort of how much information can be preserved across sort of sparser representations of something, I'm always going to be interested in.
Mike.
Yeah, I was sort of in the background thinking once again about your talk. And I understand that there is one question which I guess which comes to mind, and I want to understand what you're thinking about it. Basically, the question is how we know that the answer makes sense, basically. So you do have the procedure, you do have the algorithm, it produces some sort of groupings, some sort of topics. Is there any sort of, should we simply believe what it gives us, or is there a possibility of some sort of parallel procedure to elaborate whether it makes sense or it doesn't make sense? Because I mean, you said at some points that you decided that here and here it doesn't make sense, and you just manually corrected some things. So is there a possibility to do it somehow systematically and have some sort of comparison?
I mean, this was something I said in response to Mila's comment as well. This is the hard problem, I think, of this kind of work, right? Because on the one hand, you want what the psychologists call construct validity, right? There need to be sanity checks. The things that you are quantifying need to produce judgments that are in keeping with what people already know about certain systems and what their intuitive understanding of these concepts is. On the other hand, you want to generate new knowledge, right? You want to generate new things, right? So in the example that I gave, when in the paper that I did for epistemology abstracts, I interpreted the topics, right? And that's how I brought domain knowledge in to interpret the topics. And then once I'd interpreted the topics, I was able to ask questions about, diachronic trends. So how prevalent are these topics in each year of the corpus, each year of these abstracts? And those were questions that I genuinely didn't know the answer to. Right? I had my hunches, but I didn't know the answer to, and I was able to confirm my hunches through that kind of analysis, right? But I still needed that know-how to get to the interpretation, right? Now, on the other hand, you might imagine that a topic emerges that creates some controversy about how to interpret it, right? That in itself could be an interesting result as well, because now I say, okay, here's this topic that's like clearly prevalent in the corpus, but the experts disagree about what it's all about, what its significance is, and maybe some of the distinctiveness measures I presented today could be part of that story. And we're seeing moreover that it's really distinctive. On the other hand, if all of the topics are like that, right, then we start to think, okay, how maybe we just have low construct validity here. Maybe this methodology isn't identifying the themes that people already know are important. So this is like, I think, really deep questions that don't have good answers in the epistemology of science more broadly, right? And the relationship between quantitative methods and the kind of scientific know-how that one finds in a lot of fields, especially fields, other than physics really, that don't have, where there is a kind of ineliminable qualitative know-how, and to some extent that exists in physics too, from what I understand. But this idea that the math is only part of the story, and there's going to be something else there, and how well is that something else captured in a statistical model? I don't have all the answers there on exactly how that's meant to go. But I think, finding this balance between novelty and construct validity is kind of where you want to go. And I think I've shown some examples of how it works on a case-by-case basis. I don't yet have a general theory of how this might go, but I think it's it's in some sense the most important conceptual question for any kind of cultural data analytics.
Yeah, actually, I agree with what you just said, and that you put it very, very interestingly. And but at the same time, one thing I would be I was thinking about is the question of whether this which is essentially to some extent a simpler question, whether these blocks, these topics are not a result of overfitting, and that is probably can be possible to check by, for example, randomly removing some subset of your abstracts and seeing whether it disappears. Some of the topics probably will disappear. For example, if one topic is just essentially one abstract, it obviously will disappear whenever this abstract is randomly removed. But with others, it might be different. But then if they are robust, then you die. Yes, you will need to somehow find a way to interpret them and trust them.
Yeah, and I mean, even even things like p-values. I mean, I have some colleagues at Google Research right now who are working on p-values for machine learning. And I think just whether you're a Bayesian or a frequentist, just the question of, let's suppose there was no topical structure at all in this graph, how likely would be nevertheless to pick up on topics that look like this? I think that kind of question could be really helpful as well. And it's not something that I know of as being developed. I think I've saw one paper once on p-values for stochastic block models. So something like that as well. Whether you go more Bayesian with it right now or stick with the sort of p-value idea. Something about we have a totally unstructured corpus, just random words, in which nevertheless we were to get a topic structure like this one. If we did, then I think there's a sense in which we don't want to trust the sort of informative value of that topic structure too much, right? On the other hand, if we get very low p-values in these cases, then we might think, okay, at least we're picking up on something statistical, right? As you say, there's some robustness there. And then the question is, how does that play into the interpretation? How do we walk that line again between construct validity and novelty?
So, but this brings up as a bias issue, right? Like, obviously, psychology, perception, reading, meaning always needs a cognitive agent. And so you're basically extracting the topics directly from the texts. But to give an example, if you have, sort of Sommerfeld, which was an author in your topic, like in your case, has a sort of salence of 1 because it's sort of like only like a supportive 1. It's only in this one topic because it only appears in one paper or one abstract in your data set. But anybody who knows Sommerfeld would associate her or him with probably a whole bunch of papers, which may make more sense to have him in your data set. See what I mean? There's a kind of like...
Absolutely.
So in that sense, this is related because obviously if you're a classification machine or your block model algorithm sort of has a certain propensity to see certain things, it may in random white noise totally see structure, right? You see what I mean? It's like we look at particularly because you look at a very limited data set, right? Like if you look at a random block, it looks like it has a trajectory moving through space because you just don't wait as long until it ergodically filled the space. So that is sort of something which I think, again, we're thrown back to sort of topology, physics, and all this kind of stuff, stochastics, statistics, where it's at some point almost completely arbitrary what the content is because we need to actually deal with these numerical quantitative issues first, where we even need to think about like, okay, what kind of numbers can even appear? Like what kind of combinations can even appear? And this is sort of why graph tool is such an advance in a sense, because Thiago Peixoto sort of has this Bayesian mindset, and that's exactly underlying it. Like, you know, it's like you want to sort of not only have your own perspective as a humanist, but you want to have all possible perspectives that in a Bayesian way, in this particular case, you could have, I think. So I have
that's right. Oh, sorry.
I
should just add to that. There is still just the question of like the data, right? And like, is this the right data set? And like for the point you made, like if someone says, okay, this author is only appearing once, but I know that this author is important, then there's a sense in which I think you have to go back to, okay, are you even looking at the right data set here?
One other like sort of question, which is sort of a similar vein, like you use, like you compare, in order to have your distinctiveness measure, you have topic 1 and topic prime, T and T prime. So I use KL divergence to actually measure the divergence, which is asymmetric. So does it mean your T prime is always one layer up, or like how do you make sure that you're not like measuring one direction for some topics and the other direction for other topics, basically?
Yeah, so you're always going, so you have the topic at one level, and then you're looking at all the topics at the level up and getting the KL divergence of the topic at level 0, let's say, from the topic at level 1 and at the top.
Okay, so this makes sense. My curiosity question: why not Jensen-Shannon divergence, which is the sort of symmetric version? Like, why even like this is a purely curiosity question. Like, I'm not an expert. Like, why would one even use KL divergence? Like, why would we take the asymmetric measure version here?
Yeah, so there's a natural interpretation of KL divergence as saying if you're taking the KL divergence from P from Q, right? So P is the first distribution, Q is the second distribution. There's a natural interpretation of this as, you know, the surprise that you would have in being told that, you know, Q is the true distribution, when in fact it's P, right? So how surprising does P, the distribution P, regard the distribution Q? Right? So for me, with the kind of question I'm interested in distinctiveness is you imagine, okay, you embody the perspective of the lower level topic, right? And then you look at all the higher level topics, right? And you're looking at each one, and there's the question of, okay, how weird do each of them look to you? Right? And there's this idea that, well, if some of them look very not weird, if some of them look very unsurprising, right? At the higher level, from your perspective at the lower level, then that's showing that that lower level perspective on the topic is preserved at the higher level. So that was the reason, that's the sort of the intuitive reason behind the choice of KL divergence in particular, and of the particular order of the arguments in the KL divergence, right? I think that's, you know, I don't have a great argument for that beyond it feels like a natural way to look at it, and there might be other ways of operationalizing it as well. You know, you could go, you could go symmetric if you want to, but I think there's also, nice properties that come out of KL divergence as well.
So let me give you an argument for that. Like if you have, you can create trees by joining things, right? So this is like what people do in genetics and in library and in books, where you have affiliation copies, but you're not quite sure what is copied from what. So you can make these trees, which sort of by similarity, you couple them if they're more similar to each other. But the interesting thing is, as you end up with these trees, they typically don't have a clear root. So it's not quite clear what the direction of evolution is. And in that case, you basically do not know what's up and down in a tree at a given location. And so that is why maybe an asymmetric measure, like in your case, makes sense, because you know which way is up. But if you would throw away the dates in your abstracts, you're exactly there, basically, right? And so then the key question is, like, if you can replace KL divergence with JSD, which is the symmetric version, so it doesn't really matter if you compare T prime to T or T to T prime, that would be a sort of like maybe more universal kind of set. So if there is nothing lost using JSD, it may actually be the more optimal kind of thing to do. And so
it definitely,
sorry.
No worries. It definitely could
like
be.
Viewer 3, but I think it's just like for future work. This is like I think an interesting thought process, which very rarely one can realize.
No, you're right. You're right. I mean, look, I don't have a great reason for saying, because you could make the same argument go the other way. It's okay. Like, inhabit the perspective of each of these higher level topics. How surprising is the lower level topic to you? I think it's a little weirder because of the way I think about this in terms of information being preserved across the course graining. But you're right. If we didn't have this clear directionality for the hierarchy, then it might seem more interpretationally necessary to be having a symmetric measure. What's interesting, for my part, I mean, one thing to keep in mind is that the most sort of stark cases of distinctiveness are these cases where the distinctiveness is undefined, which I'm calling, positive infinity or maximal, and these are the cases where the exact same topic appears at one level of the hierarchy, and again up at the other level of the hierarchy. And there, whether you go symmetric or asymmetric, it's not going to make a difference. That divergence is going to be zero in both respects. And so that's that's an instance where the particular choice of divergence doesn't matter nearly so much as picking up on, and that's I think a qualitatively and categorically important case that we can pick up on here, right? So in some sense, I'd be inclined to say, look, you can imagine forgetting about which choice of divergence you use, doing this all purely categorically, and just saying, okay, find me the topics that are entirely preserved across hierarchical levels, and then you don't have to worry about the type of divergence at all. And I think you still have interesting research questions you can ask.
As there is no hands up right now, it's like let me extend the question. So you say this positive infinity thing is sort of something where is an exception in your case, because obviously, right, you're dividing by but is there some way to make this more systematic? Because as you approach zero, there's something going on already. And so I think there is a kind of interesting thing going on regarding the perception of relevance. So is that sort of linear, like how you sort of like approach that infinity, or is it become, is there something that is sort of like asymptotically going in a, like, what I'm thinking of is like Stevens's law of perception. Like if you're twice as bright, it seems twice as bright, but it's actually 10 times as bright or something like that, or is dB in sound or something like that. So if that is the case, is there something like, would you need a sort of normalizing function to actually see a more realistic kind of thing going on? And how does this distinctiveness actually work? Is there something like, you're 10% distinctive, 20% or whatever, or is it really like sort of stuff is all of a sudden very distinctive, and other than that, it's sort of like not so distinctive?
Yeah, the shape of the function is interesting. It's not going to be linear, right? Because it's in this convex divergence. We're taking the inverse of this convex divergence, so it's not going to be linear. I would have to study more exactly what the shape would look like. There's also this, because it's so multidimensional, right? We're talking about, in some of these cases, topic distributions over 30,000 words, and you can just go up from there, right? What the kind of x-axis of this graph here, where you're looking at, distinctiveness as you get closer to the maximal case of identity between the topics of the higher and lower level. What that x-axis even is I think a little tricky to visualize, but certainly it's not going to be a linear approach, I think, in virtue of KL divergence being a convex divergence. But I'd have to study more what that shape would actually look like, and whether there's anything systematic we can even really say there beyond what would just come out of using a convex divergence. And some of that is stuff I'd have to learn more about as well, in terms of the behavior, the sort of asymptotic behavior of these kinds of things. And again, what we would even be measuring that behavior with respect to, if not just the full enormous vector space that is effectively like the inputs to this, where we got essentially pairs of probability vectors, often very high dimensional, as the inputs to this distinctiveness function.
Okay. Any more questions? Yes, Mark.
Yeah.
Wait. Microphone. Just leave it here.
Okay. So thank you. First of all, I hope my question it might be a bit naive. So take it as coming from a humanist who has used really limited approaches in topic modeling, and maybe a HDB scan mostly. So it brings up the question that is there like the essential difference in whether you approach the topic modeling, like whether hierarchically or not, like from coming from networks or coming from vectors, actually?
What would you? Yeah, so I guess. So by vectors, do you mean you would just have sort of all the documents would live in a kind of latent space, and then you do sort of community detection within that latent space?
Yes.
Yeah. It's so different in terms of the generative model, right? Like this generative model here is all about, generating a topology in this kind of network structure, right? And I think in some respects, what you're proposing might get you closer to LDA, but then you could also have hierarchical structure as well, and kind of neighborhood structures within, nested within one another, that could be very interesting to look at. Yeah, I just have to think so much more about that, because thinking about, okay, how are words being represented, how are documents being represented, what's the, how's that all shaking out? As a, like I work sometimes like retrieval augmented generation and things like that, and certainly for those kinds of like relevance understanding, like how relevant is this text to that text, like those kinds of vector space representations work very well. In terms of a generative model of the words, it starts to get you very close to like a large language model, right? Essentially, and that you would be saying, okay, like here's your training data, and then you've got representation of words in the latent space that's meant to represent something like their likelihood of appearing after one another. Whether you could turn that into a hierarchical topic model is, I think, a really interesting question that I don't have an answer for here.
Yeah, but also because the hierarchicality, it's included like per topic is like really popular package, right? So it's already hierarchical part is like included in there, and
I'll have to look more at that.
Yeah, but little I've tested it. I mean, it seems to make sense to me, at least sometimes, like the hierarchicality. Yeah. But of course, it depends on the data as always. And,
right. Yeah. No, I'll have to look more into that. I wasn't aware of those kinds of tools for hierarchical topic modeling. Thank you.
But I realized the question itself was actually really broad and big, maybe.
So. No, but it's super fascinating. It's super fascinating. And part of me wants to wonder, like, are there interesting equivalences between like just a language model more broadly and these different hierarchical topic models? I think it's like that's a big research question that might well be beyond my capability, but definitely one to consider.
Yeah, great.
Excellent. We talked for almost 2 hours.
Yes.
Do you have any so maybe you could talk a little bit about like what's your like you're in psychology, right? As a department.
Yeah, so I'm actually in philosophy, and I'm going to be a philosophy professor starting in the fall. Yeah, so philosophy of science, formal epistemology, that kind of stuff. But yeah, I've worked in psychology labs or departments for the last 3 years, doing sort of, it used to be called experimental philosophy. Now I think it's more fashionable to call it, sort of philosophically inspired cognitive science, empirical cognitive science. I mean, that's what I do. A lot of my ongoing work involves sort of human experiments with adult humans. They're testing their different judgments about when the correct causal explanation for some phenomenon should be given at a coarser or finer level of description. And that's really been like the number one through line of my work through the years, is questions of granularity, levels of organization, hierarchical levels of description, etc. So naturally, these stochastic block models are, I think, a really cool tool in investigating some of those questions in a slightly different sort of formal paradigm than what I'm used to. And so in terms of this work, I mentioned it at the end, like something I'd really love to do is more experimental work, measuring the ways in which these models do or don't capture our intuitions about topicality, meaning, aboutness, etc. Right? So probably, giving humans things to read and asking them, what are the important topics here? What's the important structure here? How do things sort of nest together hierarchically? And then seeing to what extent these models can actually predict these psychological judgments. That's something I haven't seen much of out there yet, but I think something that would be very cool to investigate more.
And let me ask one final, very technical question. Where do you publish stuff? Like what's your grand scheme of what journals are relevant for this kind of work? Because obviously this touches on things which you find in digital humanities, but also one could imagine other places that are sort of say more technical / statistical. And I'm just curious, what would that be like, where you say, in 5 years I want to have papers in the following journals or something like that. I think this is probably
I think for me, so much of my DH work has been focused on my teaching. I think for me, it would be in the cognitive science literature. So cognition, cognitive psychology, cognitive science. Those are sort of the 3 journals that you think of: Topics in cognitive science, etc. And I think there's been a real push in cognitive psychology more broadly to use more naturalistic data sets, right? So instead of investigating your psychology research question of interest by running an experiment with a bunch of adults on Prolific, to actually say, okay, is there a way of asking this research question where we could look at, a massive corpus, right, and show that in fact that corpus provides evidence in favor of our psychological hypothesis, right? Because of course that corpus was written by people in some way, and when you do that, I think you get to a point where DH methodologies and psychological research questions are going to come closer together in the coming years. And that's something that I definitely want to, be working on, right? And I think the natural venues in virtue of the research questions, I'm not someone who's going to necessarily be coming up with really sort of earth-shattering new statistical methodologies or anything like that. For me, it's going to be about the research questions, which for me are motivated first and foremost, not by the sort of first order questions about the cultural stuff. That's fascinating. It's just not my expertise. From cognition and what these corpora can tell us about human cognition more broadly. And so it's in virtue of those research questions that I see the publications and the funding sources sometimes mostly coming out of that cognitive psychology, experimental philosophy kind of world.
Interesting. Cool. So yeah, I don't know. So you wanna share some last message?
I have to catch a train up to New Haven to teach. So I'm perfectly happy to end about 10 minutes early if that's okay with you, with you all. But it's just been really wonderful presenting my work and really just like great questions and a really fun discussion. Great way to start the week.
Yes. Let me do the one thing that I do every week, which is announce what's happening next time. So our next speaker will be James Evans, which you all may know from the computational social science crowd. He organized IC2S2 sort of 2 years ago now. And there he presented a thing which is called embed everything, his claim for that we should embed everything with all methods possible, which is sort of a cool premise. And we're very glad to have him next week. And then what I'd like to do, like what just happened, is like thank our speaker today and yeah, applause. Thank you very much. This was really
Thank you all very much. This has been a pleasure.
And, thank you very much for you know, when we ask critical questions, it has to do we're in different crowds and we do different things and we do it different ways. And so this was very, very inspiring for me personally to see how an experimental philosopher treats that kind of stuff. It's really cool.
That's very kind of you to say. Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me. It's been a really great conversation.
Yes, thank you. Bye-bye.
All right, take care. Bye.